And I would also note, Tom, I have long argued that it is in Iran's interest for President Trump to go up the escalation ladder and to prolong this war, because the longer the war goes on, the more leverage Iran has. And therefore, I think it made eminently good sense for President Trump to say, no more going up the escalation ladder. What we're going to do is get a ceasefire. And by the way, you all know, all the viewers, that we're just talking here about getting a ceasefire. We're not talking about negotiating the final settlement on issues like, nuclear enrichment. That will wait to the second phase. We just first have to get a ceasefire. That's what we're working on now. And hopefully President Trump will stick to his guns this time, negotiate a ceasefire, and then we can get on to hopefully working out some sort of deal or quasi-deal regarding the nuclear.
Here's another question here for you, John. Is there a way Trump can walk away from the illegal Iran war without triggering Israel's Samson option?
Well, I think there's no question that if we walk away, Trump just washes his hands of this, and there's no nuclear deal, and it looks like the Iranians may be getting a nuclear weapon. I mean, we want to understand, Tom, and your questioner, that this war has given the Iranians a powerful incentive. If they didn't have one beforehand, they certainly should have one now to acquire nuclear weapons. And we also understand that they have a lot of highly enriched uranium, uranium that's enriched to 60%, which can easily be enriched to 90%, which is weapons grade material. And they have 400 plus kilograms of that. They could probably make 10 to 12 bombs. So if we walk away and the Israelis can't deal with the problem I just described conventionally, the incentive for them to at least think and maybe even use nuclear weapons to take out a burgeoning Iranian nuclear program will be very great. So there is real danger there. But I think you don't have to worry about us walking away.
Next question, John. Is the likely and promised retaliation by Iran against surrounding countries and possibly US bases in Europe acting as a deterrent to further large-scale military strikes?
I think there's no question that the threat of retaliation against the Gulf countries and Israel and American military installations in the region is causing the United States to look for a way to get a meaningful ceasefire. If you look at what's been happening over the past couple days with these exchanges between the Iranians and the Americans, the Iranians have been launching very effective attacks at American bases in Bahrain and in Kuwait. And I am sure the Saudis are going to great lengths to tell the Americans they want absolutely nothing to do with this. I'm sure the Saudis have signaled to the Iranians, we are not playing this game. The Americans are not using our bases to attack you. They're not using our airspace because the Saudis do not want to be hit by the Iranians. It's the Kuwaitis and the Bahrainians who are being hit at this point in time. So you see this phenomenon clearly at play, and it's having an effect on us.
Next question, John, is there not a strong argument to be made that Trump will go for broke and attack Iran again, given that he has already made a number of foolish mistakes already? I mean, you could make the argument that the credibility and the prestige of the United States is at stake, and he keeps making these threats and he fails to follow through. That hurts American credibility and prestige, which, as you know, as a realist, John, is a useful supplement to American power. Does the questioner here have a point?
Well, I think the question is a very smart question because the questioner indicated that he thought it would be irrational for Trump to attack Iran. And the questioner, of course, is correct. And it may be the case that Trump, has that particular thought process and lashes out at Iran. But 2 points, very closely related. One, it's not going to work. And number two, therefore, it is irrational. Mm-hmm. And we're assuming at this point in time, maybe I should say we're all praying that Trump and his advisors will act in a rational, legal way and do everything they can to get us out of this mess that we're in.
Hypothetically, next question, suppose a nuclear weapon is used against Iran, either by Israel or the United States. Question here is, what effect could this have on nuclear proliferation in the Middle East and globally?
I think it would have a devastating effect on proliferation. It would tell everybody that they should get a nuclear weapon of their own and make sure that that nuclear weapon or nuclear weapons that they have are survivable. And I think that's one reason the United States would go to great lengths not to use nuclear weapons itself and do everything it could to prevent the Israelis from doing that. But I think it's very important that we don't cross the nuclear threshold here, either in Ukraine, where there appears to be a danger of nuclear escalation these days, or in the Middle East, in the scenario that we often talk about, where either the United States or Israel uses a nuclear weapon against Iran.
Today marks an important milestone in the Ukraine-Russia war. It's now longer than the World War I. Today's the day, John, and I can't think of a better person who's been able to explain the Ukraine conflict since 2022, or indeed since the Russian incursion in Crimea in 2014 than you, John. So changing subjects here, this is Tony from Brisbane, Australia. He's actually British, and he notes that John Healey resigned as UK Defence Secretary today. He has been saber-rattling for a war with Russia. But then he found out the UK is potless and there is no cash for the military. What a debacle. John.
Well, all the European countries are suffering economically, and there's a real 1-2 punch behind this. The first punch is the 2022 war. When it started, February 24th, 2022, you want to remember that the Europeans then began to move to cut off all oil and gas from Russia that was cheap oil and gas. And that meant that they had to buy oil and gas that was much more expensive. Mm-hmm. So the economic sanctions and the cutoff of the flow of oil and gas into Europe hurt the European economies. Then the second thing that hurt the European economies was the February 28th decision to attack Iran and create this oil crisis and gas crisis in the Gulf. And that is damaging European economies, and it's going to do much more damage over time. There's no question about that. I followed the British economy, which was not in terrific shape before any of this even happened, and they're in terrible shape now. And it's not only the British economy, it's true of the German economy as well, and the French economy. And this means that those economies are not in a position to pick up the slack of providing money and weaponry to Ukraine as the United States tries to get out of that business. Yeah. Remember, not too long ago, the United States said that it was willing to allow American weaponry to go to Ukraine. This is before the Iran war, when we used up a lot of that weaponry. But nevertheless, the deal that we were talking about before the Iran war was that the Europeans would pay for that weaponry. So the Ukrainians would get American weaponry, but the Europeans would pay for it. The United States would not pay for it. This put a huge burden on the Europeans. And again, when you talk about the economic problems that the Europeans have, there's no way they can go on sustaining Ukraine over the long term in its war against Russia. And this is one of the reasons I've long argued and continue to argue that the Russians will win a ugly victory against Ukraine.
Yeah, and on Britain, and indeed NATO, as you say, it gets back to a fundamental point that Walter Lippmann, the great American foreign policy realist of the post-war period, said about reconciling ends and means. Right, John?
Yeah, there's no question about that. That's true of the United States as well, Tom.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I mean, if the word prioritize is no longer in the American vocabulary, but
Well, the United States spends more on servicing its debt than it does on defense, and it wants to rule the world. Next question. Why are the Baltic states so aggressive and antagonistic towards Russia when they are so small and have no military? Do they really believe the Americans will bail them out if there is a war with Russia? John.
well, the Baltic states and Poland, they are just utterly convinced that the Russians are the font of all evil, and that the Russians are bent on conquering them. And they view Russian aggression as just part of the warp and woof of daily life in Russian thinking about how to deal with the world. And there's nothing you can do to change their thinking. Now, I'm with the questioner on this. If I'm playing, Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia's hand, even Poland's hand, I try to work out some sort of modus vivendi with the Russians. And as you know, Tom, I don't believe that the Russians are bent on conquering the Baltic states or Poland. They've been there, done that, didn't work out very well, and they're finished with that. And Putin has made it clear that he's not interested in reestablishing the Russian Empire. But as the questioner implies, you cannot convince the Baltic states of that. They're convinced that the Russians are coming. And what they've done is they've taken a stick and poked the Russians in the eye because they think they have the American security umbrella over them, and they can now get away with it. You see this in Polish thinking about how to deal with the Russians as well. The Poles think they're actually in quite good shape, or they have for a while thought they were in quite good shape because, again, they're in NATO. They've got the American security umbrella over them. But what they didn't realize is that Donald Trump hates Europeans and he hates NATO, and he wants to reduce the American military footprint in Europe. He wants to weaken the transatlantic alliance. And at the same time, as you and I have talked about many times, Tom, there are powerful structural forces that push the United States to pivot away from Europe to East Asia. And when you marry that to the fact that we're deeply involved in the Middle East, and that one doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon, the American military footprint in Europe is likely to be reduced in a major way. And this is going to have hugely negative consequences for the Baltic states, for Poland, and for NATO more generally.
And as you've all too often said, America and NATO have just led the Ukrainians down the primrose path. Another question, good question, academic question. Doesn't offensive realism imply Russia would dominate Ukraine regardless of NATO? Why treat NATO as a cause, not trigger? John.
There's no question that if Russia could dominate all of Ukraine and dominate East Europe or Eastern Europe at some reasonable cost, it would do that. But Russia does not have the capability to do that. I would point out to the viewer that we've earlier talked about the fact that this war has lasted longer than World War I. That's correct. Yep. Nevertheless, how much Ukrainian territory has Russia captured in those 4+ years of war? Basically 1/5 of Ukraine, the eastern 1/5 of Ukraine. And they've had a devil of a time, mainly because of drones and also because of European and American support to Ukraine. The Russians have had a devil of a time conquering that slice, rather narrow slice of Ukraine. So there's no reason to worry about Russia behaving as if it were the Soviet Union in 1945, having just rolled up the Wehrmacht and inflicted a decisive defeat on Nazi Germany. We're not there. If there's any country on the planet that's a challenge to the United States, it's called China, not Russia. Russia is the weakest of the three great powers. It's not a potential hegemon in Europe. China is really powerful and is a threat to become a potential hegemon in East Asia. And that's why if the United States were smart, it would prioritize the three regions of the world and it would focus on East Asia and pay little attention to Europe.